The first time I saw them, the lights were just pinpricks in my rearview mirror, dancing like heat shimmer against the darkening horizon. We'd been driving for 6 hours straight across the Gibson Desert, our 2-vehicle convoy cutting through red dirt and spinifex grass towards Sarah's family station reunion. My shoulders ached from gripping the wheel, and the steady hum of tires on gravel had lulled both kids into drowsy silence. I should have paid more attention to that first glimpse, should have trusted the way my gut clenched when those distant gleams appeared to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The convoy had been my idea, safer to travel in pairs out here, where the nearest town was 300 kilometers behind us and mobile phone towers were a fantasy. 2 Land Cruisers loaded with camping gear, eskies full of cold drinks, and enough spare parts to rebuild an engine if necessary. Standard Outback precautions that felt reassuring in the afternoon heat but seemed inadequate now as darkness crept across the endless red landscape. "Dad, how much further?" Emma's voice crackled through the UHF radio from the second vehicle, where Sarah was driving with our youngest, Jack, and my brother-in-law Pete. Static popped and hissed between her words, the radio struggling with the vast distances and electromagnetic interference that plagued communication in the deep outback. I glanced at the GPS mounted on my dashboard, its blue glow the only light competing with the vast star field emerging overhead. The screen showed our position as a tiny arrow, crawling across an expanse of brown that stretched to the edges of the display. Another hour to the turn-off, Em. "Your mum holding up okay back there?" Sarah's voice cut through the static, warm with familiar humor despite the fatigue that roughened her edges. "Just fine, thanks. Though Pete's complaining about my driving again." Pete's distinctive laugh filled the channel, followed by the sound of him adjusting his position in the passenger seat. "I'm just saying, love, kangaroos can't read speedometers. Slow down a bit." I checked the mirror again, squinting past the dust cloud our tires kicked up. The fine red particles hung in the air like fog, illuminated by our taillights in a cone of drifting visibility. Those lights were still there, maybe closer now. 3 distinct points of illumination, maintaining perfect formation despite the rough track and scattered potholes. Probably another vehicle taking the same route. Plenty of people used this track to reach the outer stations. Nothing unusual about that. The outback might feel empty, but it was never truly deserted. Except something about those lights nagged at me. They seemed too steady, too purposeful in their following pattern. When I hit a particularly rough patch, and our vehicle bounced sideways, the lights behind us adjusted their position instantly, maintaining that precise triangular formation. And there was something odd about their color, not the harsh white of halogen headlights, or the blue tint of LEDs, but a warm, almost organic glow that reminded me of bushfire embers, the kind of deep amber that comes from burning ironbark or mallee root. "Tom," Sarah's voice brought me back to the radio. "You seeing something back there? You've gone quiet." I realized I'd been staring at the mirror for nearly a minute, my grip on the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. The speedometer showed we'd dropped from 90 to 70 kilometers per hour without me noticing. "Just checking our tail," I said, forcing casualness into my tone. "Looks like we've got company on the track." "About time." I was starting to feel like we'd driven off the edge of the world. I smiled, despite my unease. Sarah had grown up on a station, but she'd spent the last 15 years in Perth. The profound isolation of the deep outback always took some readjusting, even for those born to it. For our kids, raised in suburbia, this landscape was as alien as Mars. The convoy rolled on through the gathering dusk, our headlights carving tunnels of visibility through the infinite dark. Spinifex grass caught the light and threw back silver reflections, while scattered ghost gums stood like pale sentinels in the gathering gloom. The lights behind us maintained their distance, never gaining, never falling back. Professional drivers maybe, or locals who knew these roads well enough to match pace with traffic ahead. That made sense. What didn't make sense was the way they seemed to drift sideways occasionally, floating several meters off the track before snapping back to the road. I watched it happen 3 times in the space of 10 minutes. The left-hand light would slide east, hovering over scrubland that couldn't possibly support a vehicle, then glide smoothly back to its position behind Pete's vehicle. Tricks of perspective, I told myself. Heat distortion playing games with my tired eyes. We'd been driving since dawn, and the endless red sameness of the Gibson could hypnotize even experienced outback travelers. But heat distortion worked differently at night, and my eyes felt sharp despite the long hours behind the wheel. "Tom, Pull over for a minute. Sarah's voice cut through my rationalization. Jack needs a bathroom break. I eased the Land Cruiser to a stop on a relatively flat stretch of track, dust billowing around us as Sarah pulled up behind me. Her brake lights painted the settling dust cloud in shades of crimson that reminded me uncomfortably of the lights we'd been watching. The silence that followed the dying engines was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through spinifex. The sudden quiet always took me by surprise on these remote stops. In the city, silence was relative. Air conditioners humming, traffic murmuring, the electronic buzz of civilization providing constant background noise. Out here, silence was a living thing that pressed against your eardrums with physical weight. I stepped out, immediately struck by the temperature drop. Days in the Gibson could hit 40 degrees, but clear nights radiated heat back to space with ruthless efficiency. The sand beneath my boots was still warm, but the air carried the sharp bite of desert cold that would have us reaching for fleeces within the hour. I grabbed a thick jacket from the back seat and looked south down our backtrack. The lights were gone. Where's our shadow? Sarah asked, following my gaze while Jack wandered off behind a low shrub, his small silhouette barely visible in the starlight. The track stretched behind us in a straight line for at least 5 kilometers, disappearing into darkness at the limit of vision. No headlights, no dust cloud, no sign that any other vehicle had been following us. Must have turned off somewhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there hadn't been any turnoffs in the last 20 kilometers. The track we'd been following was barely maintained, little more than tire ruts and the occasional grader scrape. Sidetracks were rare, and usually marked by station signs or mining company warnings. I would have noticed another vehicle leaving the main route. Pete stretched beside his open door, vertebrae popping audibly in the still air. Probably just stopped for their own break. These roads aren't exactly freeways. Plenty of room for everyone. Emma, my practical 12-year-old, stood scanning the horizon with her father's eyes. Her posture reminded me of Sarah at that age. Alert, curious, unafraid of the vast spaces that made some people feel small and vulnerable. Dad, why do the stars look different out here? No light pollution, I explained, grateful for the distraction from my growing unease. In the city, streetlights and buildings wash out everything except the brightest stars. Out here, you can see what the night sky really looks like. And it was spectacular. The Milky Way stretched overhead like spilled flour, so dense with stars that the familiar constellations almost disappeared in the celestial crowd. The Southern Cross hung low and brilliant, while Venus glowed like a distant headlight on the western horizon. Canopus blazed white-hot near the zenith, and the Coalsack Nebula created a dark wound in the river of stars that seemed to pulse with its own mysterious energy. It was Venus that made me notice the problem. When Jack finished his business, and we prepared to continue, I took one last look south. The lights were back, but now they hung several meters above the track, suspended in empty air like miniature stars. As I watched, they drifted east, then west, then returned to their position directly behind our route. The movement was fluid, purposeful, completely unbound by gravity or any physical constraints I understood. No vehicle moved like that. No aircraft either. Too low, too slow, too quiet. And the color was wrong, that same warm amber glow that seemed almost organic, like something alive rather than mechanical. Everything all right? Sarah asked, noticing my hesitation. Her voice carried the particular note of concern that came from 15 years of marriage and learning to read my moods. She stood with one hand on Jack's shoulder, her attention focused on my face rather than the mysterious lights. I almost told her then, almost pointed out the impossible display, and asked if she saw them too. But Jack was tired and cranky, Emma was already climbing back into my passenger seat, and Pete was making jokes about bathroom facilities in 5-star establishments. This was supposed to be a family adventure, not a source of anxiety. The kids had been excited about this trip for months, and I didn't want to spoil their enthusiasm with half-formed fears about lights that probably had some perfectly rational explanation. Just checking the GPS, I said instead, making sure we're on track for the roadhouse. We climbed back into our vehicles, engines coughing to life in the thin air. The altitude here was barely 800 meters, but something about the desert atmosphere made engines work harder, fuel burn faster, batteries drain quicker. As we pulled away, I watched the lights in my mirror. They followed us, maintaining that impossible aerial position for nearly a kilometer before settling back onto what should have been the road surface. But even then, their behavior remained wrong. They moved too smoothly over terrain that should have bounced any normal vehicle, like a ping-pong ball. The next hour passed in relative silence, punctuated only by occasional radio check-ins and Pete's increasingly elaborate complaints about Sarah's driving style. "She's doing 90 on a track that barely qualifies as a goat path," his voice crackled through the speaker. "I've got bruises from hitting the roof every time she hits a pothole." Sarah's response was cheerfully unsympathetic. "Maybe if you wore your seatbelt properly instead of slouching like a teenager." The familiar banter was comforting, a reminder that some things remained normal even as the lights behind us continued their strange dance. Sometimes on the track, sometimes floating beside it, occasionally disappearing entirely before reappearing in unexpected positions. I'd started keeping mental notes of their behavior, the way they moved against the prevailing wind, accelerated without engine noise, and twice appeared to split into multiple sources before reconverging into a triangular formation. By the time we reached the roadhouse, I'd catalogued at least a dozen instances of physically impossible behavior. The lights had moved through solid matter, defied gravity, and demonstrated what could only be described as intelligence in their responses to changes in our convoy's speed and direction. The roadhouse itself was a welcome sight, a low-slung building of weathered corrugated iron and glass, surrounded by fuel pumps that looked older than my marriage. Yellow light spilled from windows into the JAS parking area, where several road trains were parked in the truck bay. Their drivers were likely grabbing mandatory rest hours before continuing their marathon hauls across the continent. The building sat in a pool of artificial illumination that felt like civilization after hours of darkness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, moths danced around the globes, and the comforting smell of bacon grease and truck stop coffee drifted from the open doorway. "Civilization at last," Sarah announced over the radio as we pulled into the car park. "I'm buying coffee for everyone, and I don't care if it tastes like motor oil." The roadhouse interior was exactly what I'd expected. Linoleum floors worn smooth by work boots, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the comforting smell of bacon grease and truck stop coffee. The air conditioning worked overtime against the desert heat, creating a pocket of cool air that felt almost shocking after hours in the warming vehicle cabins. A handful of travelers occupied scattered tables, while two truck drivers shared war stories at the counter. Their voices carried the particular cadence of men who spent most of their time alone, making conversation count when the opportunity arose. The woman behind the register looked like she'd been there since the roadhouse opened, weathered and practical in the way of Outback locals. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd served thousands of travelers, and her eyes carried the particular alertness of people who lived on the edges of civilization. Her name tag read Maureen, and her smile was genuinely welcoming despite the late hour and our obviously travel-worn appearance. "Passing through to the Henderson reunion?" she asked, apparently recognizing the family group dynamic. "You're the third lot today. Popular event this year." "Sarah's family," I explained, accepting a steaming mug of coffee that smelled better than it had any right to. The ceramic was thick and practical, designed to survive dropping on concrete floors and washing in industrial dishwashers. "We're running a bit behind schedule." "How's the track north from here?" Maureen's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. Her hands stilled on the coffee machine, and she glanced toward the windows where our vehicles sat in the glow of the roadhouse lights. "Fine during daylight." "You planning to push through tonight?" "That was the idea. We've got good headlights, and the kids are handling the drive well." Sarah joined the conversation, shifting Jack's weight on her hip, while he dozed against her shoulder. "Any particular reason we shouldn't?" Maureen hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Her fingers drummed once against the counter, and she looked around the roadhouse, as if checking who might overhear. "Might want to consider stopping here for the night. We've got rooms available." The way she said it carried weight beyond the simple offer of accommodation. Pete, who'd been browsing the limited selection of road maps near the door, looked up with interest. "What kind of unusual things?" he asked, his journalistic instincts engaged. "Lights, mostly. Following vehicles, behaving strangely. Aboriginal folks call them min-min lights, old phenomenon in these parts." She shrugged, trying to project casual dismissal, but her eyes remained serious. Most likely just atmospheric conditions, heat distortion, that sort of thing. But some people find it distracting. The words hit me like cold water. Min lights. I'd heard the stories, of course, but always filed them with UFO sightings and Bigfoot encounters. Tourist nonsense designed to add mystique to Outback road trips, except I'd been watching lights behave exactly as Maureen described for the last 100 kilometers. My coffee mug suddenly felt heavy in my hands, the ceramic absorbing heat from my palms. "Have you seen them yourself?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Maureen's pause stretched uncomfortably long. She busied herself wiping down the already clean counter, her movements deliberate and careful. "I've lived out here 40 years. I've seen plenty of things that don't fit in neat categories." She glanced around the roadhouse again, checking who might overhear, then leaned closer. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I'll tell you this much. When the lights come calling, it's better to stop moving and wait for dawn. They lose interest once the sun comes up." Emma tugged at my sleeve, her young face serious with the particular intensity children brought to new information. "Dad, what are min lights?" Before I could answer, one of the truck drivers at the counter turned toward us. He was a big man with arms like tree trunks, and the deep tan of someone who'd spent decades under the Outback sun. His hands were scarred from years of handling chains and tarps, and his eyes carried the particular alertness of professional drivers. "You folks heading north tonight?" he asked, his tone carrying unmistakable concern. "Planning on it," Sarah replied, though I noticed her looking at me uncertainly. Jack stirred against her shoulder, mumbling something inaudible in his sleep. The trucker shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying weight beyond simple disagreement. "I've been running these roads for 20 years, and I'm telling you, don't travel that stretch in the dark, not tonight." "Why tonight specifically?" Pete asked, setting down the map he'd been studying. The trucker gestured toward the windows, where our dust-covered vehicles sat under the harsh glare of the security lights. "Conditions are perfect for them. Clear sky, no moon, temperature differential between day and night." He paused, studying our small group with the assessment of someone used to reading people quickly and accurately. "You've already seen them, haven't you, following your convoy?" The accuracy of his guess sent ice down my spine. My coffee grew cold in my hands as I struggled to process how a complete stranger could know what we'd experienced. "How did you?" Because they always start that way, curious at first, keeping their distance. But once you hit that northern stretch, especially around Devil's Marbles territory, they get more interactive. Sarah set Jack down gently, making sure he was steady on his feet before moving closer to me. Her hand found my arm, fingers tightening with unconscious need for physical contact. "Interactive how?" Maureen and the trucker exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. The kind of shared knowledge that came from years of living in the same harsh environment, dealing with the same inexplicable phenomena. Finally, Maureen spoke, her voice careful and measured. "They follow the road, but they don't follow road rules. They'll pace you, circle you, sometimes get close enough to light up your cabin. Most times, nothing comes of it, just a light show that'll give you nightmares for months." She paused, her weathered hands still moving over the counter in nervous patterns. "But sometimes..." "Sometimes what?" I pressed, my voice sharper than I'd intended. The trucker finished her sentence with the bluntness of someone who'd seen too much to worry about sounding dramatic. "Sometimes people don't make it to their destination on schedule. Sometimes they arrive with gaps in their memory, or stories that don't make sense. And sometimes, not often mind you, sometimes they don't arrive at all." The roadhouse lights faded to pinpricks in our mirrors as we pulled back onto the highway, the asphalt stretching endlessly into darkness ahead. Sarah had argued for staying the night at the roadhouse, her practical nature warring with the growing unease that Maureen's warnings had planted. But Pete was adamant about reaching the station by morning, something about helping Uncle Jim prepare for the arrival of other relatives. The reunion had been planned for months, and people were traveling from 3 states to attend. I found myself caught between my wife's growing concern and my brother's stubborn adherence to schedule. The decision was made for us when the roadhouse manager mentioned they were fully booked with stranded travelers, a mining crew whose vehicle had broken down, and 2 separate families who'd decided the warnings were worth heeding. "We'll drive in convoy formation," I called across to Pete through our open windows as we prepared to leave. The night air carried the bite of desert cold, and my breath steamed as I spoke. "No getting separated, And if anything strange happens, we pull over immediately. Pete nodded, though I could see skepticism in his expression. His background in journalism made him naturally suspicious of local folklore and supernatural explanations. "You're not seriously buying into all that min-min nonsense, are you?" I didn't answer. The truth was, I'd spent the last hour trying to rationalize what we'd experienced, but every explanation fell apart under scrutiny. Atmospheric phenomena didn't exhibit curiosity. Reflected light didn't change direction independently of its source. And whatever had been following us earlier had displayed an intelligence that made my skin crawl. As we rejoined the highway, Sarah twisted in her passenger seat to check on the kids. Emma was reading by flashlight, while Jack dozed against his car seat, thumb firmly planted in his mouth. The familiar sight of my children safe and comfortable should have been reassuring, but instead it emphasized how much I had to lose if the locals' warnings proved accurate. "Maybe we should have tried harder to find somewhere to stay," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "It'll be fine," I said, though my grip on the steering wheel betrayed my uncertainty. "It's only 3 more hours to the station. We'll be there before midnight." For the first hour, the road remained blessedly normal. Pete's taillight stayed a consistent distance ahead, our convoy maintaining steady progress through the darkness. The highway was better maintained than the track we'd been following, with proper lane markings and reflective posts that caught our headlights at regular intervals. The kids fell asleep to the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt, and even Sarah's tension seemed to ease as kilometers passed without incident. I began to think we might have overreacted to the locals' warnings. Min-min lights, or no min-min lights, we were experienced Outback travelers with reliable vehicles and proper emergency equipment. Whatever atmospheric phenomena the region was known for, we could handle a few unexplained lights in the distance. Then Emma sat bolt upright in the back seat, her book forgotten on her lap. "Dad, they're back." I checked the mirrors and felt my stomach drop. 3 lights hung in the distance behind us, matching our speed with unnatural precision. But these weren't the same tentative glows that had followed us before. These lights were brighter, more defined, and they pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. The amber glow had intensified to something closer to orange, with threads of deeper red that writhed through the luminosity like living things. "How long have they been there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady for the children's sake. My hands felt slick on the steering wheel despite the air conditioning. "I just noticed them, but..." Emma squinted through the rear window, her young face creased with concentration. "They're getting closer." Sarah turned to look and immediately grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into the muscle with unconscious force. "David, they're not on the road." She was right. The lights floated approximately 10 feet above the asphalt, maintaining perfect formation as they approached. There was no dust cloud, no engine noise, no heat shimmer from exhaust systems. Just 3 points of impossible illumination that moved through the air, like swimming through water. I pressed the accelerator, watching. Our speedometer climbed from 90 to 100 kilometers per hour. Pete's vehicle accelerated ahead of us, clearly responding to our increased speed. His brake lights flashed once, a question, and I flashed my headlights twice in response. The signal we'd agreed on for "something's wrong but keep moving." The lights kept pace effortlessly. At 110 kilometers per hour, they maintained their triangular formation without any apparent effort. At 120, they began to drift closer, their luminosity intensifying until I could see details in their structure. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered, but her rational mind was fighting against the evidence of her senses. "There has to be an explanation." Jack stirred in his car seat, blinking sleepily at the suddenly tense atmosphere in the cabin. His small voice cut through our adult fear with the devastating directness of childhood. "What's happening? Why is everyone scared?" Before I could respond, the lights suddenly divided. One remained behind us while the other 2 swept wide, flanking our convoy on either side. They moved with fluid grace, completely unbound by physics as I understood it. The left-hand light passed directly over a cluster of scrub trees, and the vegetation was illuminated from above in stark detail. Every leaf and branch stood out with impossible clarity, casting shadows that moved independently of the light source. The shadows writhed and twisted as if alive, reaching toward the highway with grasping tendrils that made my vision blur and my head pound with sudden pressure. Pete's brake lights flared ahead, and I saw him slow our convoy considerably. Through his rear window I could see him gesturing frantically at something in his mirrors. The radio crackled to life. We'd agreed on a channel before leaving the roadhouse. "David, are you seeing this? The bloody things are everywhere now." His voice carried an edge of panic that I'd never heard before. Pete was unflappable by nature, the kind of man who found rational explanations for everything, and maintained his composure in any crisis. To hear genuine fear in his voice sent adrenaline flooding through my system. I counted at least 6 lights now, with more appearing from beyond the range of our headlights. They seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, rising from behind ridges and materializing above the scattered rock formations that dotted this stretch of country. Each light was distinct in character. Some pulsed slowly while others flickered like flames. Some were white-hot while others glowed with colors I couldn't name. Greens that hurt to look at directly, purples that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of visible spectrum, blues so deep they appeared almost black until they shifted and revealed their true nature. "Pull over," Sarah urged, her hand still gripping my arm with bruising force. "Remember what that woman said. Stop moving and wait for dawn." But something about the lights, behavior, suggested that stopping might be exactly the wrong choice. They weren't just following us anymore, they were hurting us. Every time I considered pulling over, more lights appeared on the roadside, effectively boxing us in. They moved with obvious coordination, responding to our changes in speed and direction, with the precision of a pack predicting prey behavior. Our only option was to continue forward, deeper into whatever trap they were constructing around us. "Pete, I think we need to maintain speed," I radioed, my voice tight with controlled fear. "Don't stop unless absolutely necessary." "Copy that." "But David, there's something else. My GPS stopped working about 10 minutes ago." "According to the odometer, we've covered 40 kilometers since the roadhouse, but my GPS shows we haven't moved at all." I glanced at our own navigation system and felt a chill of recognition. The screen displayed our position as stationary at the roadhouse, despite the clearly passing landscape outside our windows. The little blue arrow that represented our convoy remained fixed in place, while the road markers scrolled past at 100 kilometers per hour. Our cell phones showed no signal, not unusual in remote areas, but the timing felt ominous. When I tried the radio's emergency channel, I received only static that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the lights surrounding us. The lights began to close in more aggressively, their movements becoming bolder and more invasive. One drifted so close to our passenger side that Sarah pressed herself against my shoulder, instinctively recoiling from the window. Through the glass, I could see the light wasn't a simple orb, it had structure, layers of luminosity that shifted and swirled like liquid fire. The outer edge was pure white heat, but deeper in the core, colors moved that had no names in human language. And within those layers, shapes moved that might have been optical illusions, or might have been something far more disturbing. Geometric patterns that folded in on themselves impossibly, creating angles that hurt to perceive directly. "Daddy, I don't like this," Emma whispered from the back seat, her earlier fascination replaced by genuine fear. Her voice was small and tight, the way it got when nightmares woke her in the early hours of morning. "I know, sweetheart, we're going to be okay." But even as I spoke the words, I wondered if I was lying to my own daughter. The lights had surrounded us completely now, forming a loose sphere around our 2-vehicle convoy. They pulsed in unison, creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. The effect was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, as if something was attempting to establish a connection that bypassed rational thought. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I had to fight to keep my focus on the road ahead. The asphalt seemed to ripple like water, and the lane markings writhed like living things trying to escape the paint that bound them. Pete's voice crackled through the radio, strained with panic that made his words barely comprehensible. "David, my engine's cutting out. The electrical system is going haywire." I could see his taillights flickering erratically, flashing in patterns that seemed to respond to the pulsing of the lights around us. His speedometer lights strobed on and off, and even his hazard flashes activated and deactivated randomly. Our own dashboard began displaying warning signals. The temperature gauge spiked, then dropped to 0, the fuel indicator bounced wildly, and the speedometer spun like a broken compass. Yet the engine continued running, and we maintained our forward progress through the supernatural gauntlet. The sounds our vehicles made changed too. The familiar rumble of the diesel engine took on harmonics that resonated in my chest cavity, creating frequencies that seemed designed to induce fear in human nervous systems. Sarah had pulled both children toward the center of the back seat, wrapping them in her arms as if she could shield them from whatever forces surrounded us. Jack was crying softly, while Emma stared out the windows with wide, frightened eyes. Her 12-year-old composure had finally cracked under the weight of impossibility pressing in on all sides. "How much further to the station?" Sarah asked, though she seemed to already know that normal distances no longer applied. I tried to calculate based on our departure time and estimated speed, but the numbers refused to make sense. We should have been close by now, yet the landscape outside remained unchanged, the same endless expanse of scrubland, the same scattered rock formations, the same star-filled sky above the supernatural light show. Time itself seemed to have become elastic, stretching and contracting according to rules that had nothing to do with human measurement. Then Pete's vehicle began to slow dramatically. His engine noise changed from a steady rumble to an irregular coughing that suggested imminent failure. Through the radio came his increasingly frantic voice. "I'm losing power, the engine's dying." The lights immediately responded to this change, their formation tightening around both vehicles. Those closest to Pete's car brightened considerably, bathing his entire vehicle in cold, white radiance that seemed to leach color from everything it touched. I watched in horror as his car drifted to a stop, the lights forming a dense cluster around it like moths attracted to a flame. But these moths were the size of automobiles, and their attraction suggested hunger, rather than simple curiosity. "Pete, can you hear me?" I called into the radio, but received only static in response. The interference had intensified, creating patterns of noise that sounded almost like voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The lights surrounding our vehicle began to pulse more rapidly, and I realized with growing terror that they were separating us. A wall of luminosity was materializing between our car and Pete's, growing denser and more opaque by the second. Through the shifting barrier of light, I could barely make out the silhouette of Pete's disabled vehicle. The shapes inside the car were motionless. Whether from fear, unconsciousness, or something worse, I couldn't tell. I pressed the accelerator, hoping to reach them before the separation became complete, but our car lurched forward only a few meters before the engine died completely. Every electrical system failed simultaneously: lights, radio, air conditioning, even the dashboard clock. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. We sat in perfect darkness, surrounded by the otherworldly glow, cut off from Pete and my other children. The only sounds were our own breathing and Jack's quiet crying, both seeming impossibly loud in the supernatural stillness. Jack's crying intensified in the sudden quiet, while Sarah's breathing came in short, panicked gasps that fogged the windows despite the lack of air conditioning. Emma had gone completely silent, her small hand finding mine in the darkness. Her fingers were ice-cold and trembling, but her grip was steady and strong. "What do they want?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above Jack's sobs. I had no answer. The lights had achieved whatever they'd been working toward. Our convoy was separated, our vehicles disabled, our communications severed. We were completely at their mercy, stranded in a pocket of impossibility somewhere in the heart of the Australian outback. Outside, the lights began to move in complex patterns, weaving around our motionless car like dancers following some ancient choreography. Their luminosity intensified until the entire interior of our vehicle was bathed in cold, white radiance that seemed to penetrate every shadow. The light carried weight, pressing against the windows and body panels with force that made the metal creak and groan. I could feel it against my skin like static electricity, raising the hair on my arms and making my teeth ache. And in that moment, staring into the heart of the Min-Min phenomenon with my family trapped beside me, I finally understood what the roadhouse locals had been trying to tell us. This wasn't about lights or atmospheric conditions or tourist attractions. This was about forces that existed beyond human comprehension, ancient intelligences that treated our modern world as an intrusion into their timeless domain. The lights pressed closer, their alien presence filling the car with sensations that had no names in human language. Temperature fluctuations that moved through our bodies in waves, electromagnetic fields that made our bones ache, and something else. A presence that felt like being observed by minds vast and utterly inhuman. I made the only choice available to a desperate father protecting his children. My hand found the ignition key, fingers trembling with more than cold. I turned it once, twice, praying to whatever powers might fair or listen that our car would start, that we could somehow fight our way through the supernatural barrier and reach the rest of our family before it was too late. The engine turned over once with a grinding sound that seemed to cause physical pain to the lights surrounding us. Their perfect formations wavered, luminosity flickering like candle flames in wind. I turned the key again. The starter motor engaged, turned over twice, then died. But the lights recoiled further, their coordinated movements becoming erratic and uncertain. On the third attempt, the engine caught with a roar that seemed impossibly loud in the supernatural stillness. Every electrical system flickered back to life simultaneously, headlights blazing, radio crackling with static, dashboard illuminated in familiar amber. The Min lights recoiled as if struck, their perfect formations wavering for the first time since this nightmare began. Several of the smaller lights actually winked out, while others retreated rapidly toward the darkness beyond our headlight beams. "Hold on," I shouted, throwing the car into gear. Sarah grabbed the door handle with white knuckles while Emma clutched Jack tighter in the back seat. The wall of light ahead looked impenetrable, a shimmering barrier that stretched from the ground to somewhere high above our roof. It writhed with colors that shouldn't exist, creating patterns that made my eyes water and my head pound with sudden pressure. But through its translucent depths, I could see the dark outline of Pete's vehicle and the shadows of my other children inside. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The moment our bumper touched the light barrier, reality convulsed around us. The sensation was like driving through liquid electricity. Every nerve in my body fired simultaneously, while the car bucked and shuddered, as if we were plowing through thick mud instead of empty air. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands with frequency that seemed designed to shatter bone, and the seat beneath me pulsed with heat that penetrated through clothing to burn against skin. The lights screamed, not audibly, but somehow directly into our minds, a sound like tearing silk mixed with the cry of something ancient and furious. The noise bypassed our ears entirely, resonating in our skulls with volume that threatened to crack our teeth. Sarah's hand found mine on the gearshift, her fingers ice cold but steady. "Don't stop," she whispered through gritted teeth, and I realized that somewhere in the last few minutes, her skepticism had finally shattered against the undeniable reality surrounding us. The barrier fought us with increasing desperation. Our headlights revealed nothing but swirling luminescence, while the engine temperature spiked and warning lights flashed across the dashboard. The car's frame groaned under stresses that shouldn't have existed, metal protesting against forces that had no business affecting physical matter. Paint began to peel from the hood in long strips that whipped away into the supernatural maelstrom, while the windshield developed spider web cracks that spread and healed and spread again in endless cycles. Then, like bursting through the surface of a lake, we broke free. Pete's car materialized directly ahead, still dark and motionless but blessedly solid and real. The wall of light collapsed behind us with what felt like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the ground that rocked both vehicles on their suspension. I slammed on the brakes, sliding to a stop just meters from Pete's rear bumper, our headlights illuminating his license plate and the familiar outline of camping gear strapped to his roof rack. "Pete," I shouted into the radio, my voice hoarse from screaming against the supernatural assault. "Pete, can you hear me?" Static answered, then suddenly his voice crackled through, shaky but unmistakably relieved. "Jesus, mate, what just happened?" One second we were surrounded, the next, "Are the kids okay?" Scared senseless, but yeah, they're all here. Sarah's shaking like a leaf, and your nephew's asking questions I don't know how to answer. Car won't start though. I looked in the rearview mirror. The lights had retreated but not disappeared. They formed a loose circle around both our vehicles now, keeping their distance, but clearly not finished with us. Their glow had dimmed to something almost sullen, like embers nursing their heat for another flare. The largest ones pulsed with what looked like frustrated anger, while the smaller lights darted back and forth like agitated insects. "We need to get Pete's car running," I told Sarah, already reaching for the door handle. "Don't go out there," she said, catching my wrist with surprising strength. "Not with those things still." "I have to try. We can't leave them stranded." The moment I opened the door, the temperature differential hit me like a physical blow. Despite the warm Outback night, the air around the Min lights carried an Arctic chill that made my breath steam. Frost was actually forming on the metal surfaces of our vehicles, crystallizing in patterns that looked almost like script in some alien language. The silence was equally unsettling. No insect sounds, no wind, Even our own heartbeats seemed muffled by some acoustic dampening effect that defied explanation. I walked toward Pete's car, hyper-aware of the lights tracking my movement. They maintained their distance but followed like curious predators, their luminosity shifting through spectrums I couldn't name. Some cycled through colors that existed just beyond the edge of human vision, while others pulsed with frequencies that made my bones ache and my vision blur. Pete rolled down his window as I approached, his face pale but determined. "Pop the hood," I said. "Let's see what they did." What I found under Pete's hood defied every mechanical principle I'd learned in 30 years of maintaining farm equipment. Nothing was physically damaged, but everything metal had a strange patina, as if the lights had somehow altered the molecular structure of the components. The battery terminals were covered in crystalline growths that looked like frost but didn't melt when touched. When I tried to brush them away, they crumbled like ash, leaving the metal beneath unmarked, but somehow different, colder than it should be, with a texture that felt almost organic against my fingertips. "Try starting it now," I called. Pete turned the key. Nothing happened. Not even the click of a dead battery or the grinding of a faulty starter motor. Complete electrical silence, as if the lights had drained every electron from the system. The lights began moving again, contracting their circle with obvious intent. I could feel their attention like weight against my back, alien intelligence studying our desperate attempts at mechanical repair. They'd disabled Pete's car through means I couldn't understand, and conventional fixes weren't going to work against supernatural interference. "Dad," Emma's voice called from our car, cutting through my growing panic. "Look." I followed her pointing finger toward the eastern horizon, where the faintest suggestion of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Just a hint of gray against the black, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent years watching sunrises from remote locations. The change was subtle, a lessening of the darkness rather than actual light, but it carried the promise of sunrise still hours away. The Min lights had noticed it too. Their movements became more agitated, formations tightening and expanding like breathing. Several of the outermost lights began to fade, their luminosity dimming as the eastern horizon brightened by degrees. The largest ones actually retreated toward the western darkness, pulling back, as if the approaching dawn physically repelled them. "Pete, try it again," I said, hope creeping into my voice for the first time since this nightmare began. This time the engine turned over immediately, catching with a healthy rumble that sounded like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. The remaining lights retreated rapidly, pulling back toward the western darkness as if the approaching dawn physically repelled them. Within minutes, only a handful remained visible, hovering at the edge of perception like afterimages burned into tired retinas. Their retreat was orderly but obviously reluctant, formations maintaining some semblance of structure even as they faded into the pre-dawn gloom. Pete's family transferred back to their own vehicle, while I kept watch on the diminishing phenomena. The children were quiet, even the youngest seeming to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of the world. Jack clung to Sarah with the desperate intensity of a child who'd glimpsed terrors beyond his ability to comprehend, while Emma moved with careful deliberation, as if sudden movements might somehow summon the lights back. Sarah helped buckle seatbelts with hands that trembled slightly, her movements careful and deliberate. "Are we safe now?" Emma asked as I climbed back into the driver's seat. I looked toward the horizon, where genuine sunrise was still hours away but unmistakably approaching. The sky had lightened just enough to reveal the landscape around us, endless scrubland dotted with termite mounds and scattered ghost gums, looking exactly as ordinary and non-threatening as any Outback vista. No sign that this stretch of highway had recently hosted impossible phenomena that challenged every assumption about reality. The last Min light flickered once and vanished, leaving us alone on the empty road with nothing but tire tracks and our own shattered assumptions for proof that any of it had happened. "Yeah, sweetheart, we're safe." The reunion with the station family felt surreal after what we'd experienced. Uncle Ron and Aunt Margaret welcomed us with the same enthusiasm they'd always shown, their weathered faces creasing with genuine pleasure as our dusty convoy pulled up to the homestead. The familiar sounds of family gathering filled the air. Children's laughter, adults sharing stories over cold beers, the sizzle of meat on the barbecue. Cousins ran around the homestead with the boundless energy of kids freed from city constraints, while adults settled into comfortable chairs on the wide veranda. But our family moved through the festivities like people in a dream, still processing the impossible encounter that had nearly torn us apart just hours earlier. Sarah and I found ourselves drawn together repeatedly throughout the weekend, checking on each other with touches and glances that spoke of shared trauma. Small gestures that might have looked like ordinary married affection to observers, but carried deeper significance for those who'd faced the inexplicable together. The children stayed closer than usual, their normal independence temporarily replaced by a need for parental proximity that we didn't question. Even Pete, usually the most social member of our extended family, seemed subdued and thoughtful. It was Emma who finally broke the family silence on our second evening at the station. We were sitting on the veranda watching stars emerge in the vast outback sky when she said, "The lights were intelligent, weren't they?" Her voice carried the particular certainty that children brought to observations adults preferred to rationalize away. Pete looked up from the guitar he'd been tuning for a sing-along, his fingers stilling on the strings. "What do you mean, love? They knew things. About us, about our cars. They separated us on purpose." Her 10-year-old logic was unassailable and deeply unsettling. "They felt." Sarah paused, searching for words that could encompass what we'd experienced. "They felt old, really old, like we were the visitors." I nodded slowly, grateful that someone else had sensed the same thing. In the safety of the homestead, surrounded by family and electric lights, and all the comfortable mundane details of human civilization, I could finally admit what I'd felt during those terrifying hours. Like we'd wandered into something that was here long before roads or cars or people. The conversation that followed lasted well past the children's usual bedtime. We found ourselves dissecting every detail, the lights, formations, their apparent communication, the way they'd affected our vehicles with surgical precision. Pete described sensations I'd experienced too, but hadn't known how to articulate. The feeling of being studied, of intelligence vast and alien, turning its attention toward our small human drama. The sense that we were specimens in some incomprehensible experiment. Should we report it? Sarah asked eventually, her practical nature asserting itself despite everything we'd witnessed. "I mean, to someone official." Uncle Ron laughed, but not unkindly. His weathered hands gestured toward the vast darkness beyond the homestead lights. "Report what? That you saw the Min-Min lights? Welcome to the Outback, city folk. Half the stations out here have stories. But the way they behaved. Every Min-Min story's different," he said, settling back in his chair with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "Some folks see dancing lights that keep their distance. Others tell about being followed for hours. Few years back, a truckie swore they guided him to safety when his GPS failed." He paused, studying our faces in the lamplight with the assessment of someone who'd learned to read the difference between tourist curiosity and genuine encounter. "Point is, nobody's got explanations. It's just part of living out here." That night, lying in the station's guest room with Sarah curled against my side, I stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what we'd experienced with everything I thought I knew about the world. The rational part of my mind still searched for explanations: atmospheric phenomena, equipment malfunctions, stress-induced hallucinations. But deeper than rationality, in places that civilization hadn't completely tamed, I knew better. We'd touched something ancient and inexplicable, and survived to tell the tale. "We were lucky," Sarah whispered in the darkness, her voice barely audible over the station generator humming in the distance. I tightened my arms around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with Outback dust and the lingering smell of campfire smoke from the evening gathering. "Yeah, they could have, if they'd wanted to hurt us, but they didn't." I kissed the top of her head, finding comfort in the simple reality of her presence. Maybe that's what matters. The drive home took us along different roads, a longer route that added hours to our journey, but avoided the stretch where we'd encountered the lights. Nobody questioned the decision when I announced the alternate path during breakfast on our final morning. Even the children seemed relieved, though we didn't discuss our reasons directly. The new route took us through different country, more settled regions with regular town stops and mobile phone coverage. Ordinary highways with normal traffic and truck stops that sold nothing more mysterious than stale sandwiches and overpriced fuel. But something had changed in all of us during those supernatural hours. The family that drove back to Brisbane carried new knowledge about the vastness of the Outback and our own small place within it. We'd touched something ancient and inexplicable, and survived to tell the tale. Emma started checking out library books about Australian folklore and Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, her young mind hungry for frameworks that could accommodate what she'd witnessed. Pete became fascinated with astronomy, spending hours studying star charts and learning constellation names, as if understanding the night sky might somehow explain the impossible lights we'd encountered. Sarah began planning future family trips with a reverence for remote places that she'd never shown before, her practical nature now tempered with respect for forces beyond human comprehension. As for me, I found myself looking differently at maps of Queensland's interior, seeing not just roads and towns but spaces where the modern world grew thin and older realities pressed close to the surface. The Outback had shown us its hidden face, and while the memory carried terror, it also held a strange kind of privilege. We'd been chosen, for what, I still couldn't say. But we'd been deemed worthy of survival, of being allowed to return to our ordinary lives carrying extraordinary secrets. The Min lights had tested us and found us sufficient. Not threatening enough to eliminate, not important enough to keep, but somehow worthy of the encounter itself. 3 months later, I received a call from a cousin who lived near Charleville. He'd heard through family channels about our light show on the road to Ron's station, and wanted to share his own encounter from the previous year. Similar story, mysterious lights, disabled vehicles, the sense of being studied by intelligences that existed outside normal understanding. His voice carried the same mixture of awe and lingering unease that I heard in my own when discussing what we'd experienced. Funny thing is, he said near the end of our conversation, it's brought our family closer together. Nothing like shared impossible experiences to make you appreciate what you've got. I looked across our kitchen table at Sarah helping Jack with homework, while Emma and Pete argued good-naturedly over whose turn it was to feed the dog. Ordinary domestic chaos, made precious by the memory of how easily it could have been lost on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. The simple reality of my family safe and together carried weight it had never possessed before our encounter with the impossible. Yeah, I told my cousin, watching my wife's patient smile, as she guided Jack's pencil across his mathematics worksheet. I know exactly what you mean. The Outback holds its secrets jealously, revealing them only to those who venture far enough from civilization's comfort zones to prove their courage, or perhaps their foolishness. We'd driven into the heart of mystery and emerged, changed, marked by the knowledge that Australia's remote spaces contain wonders and terrors that maps can't chart and science can't explain. In the end, maybe that's enough. Some experiences don't require understanding, only respect. The Min lights had shown us the Outback's hidden face, and we'd been humble enough to survive the encounter. Our family had been tested by forces beyond comprehension, and found ourselves stronger for having endured together. The red dirt roads still call to us, promising adventure in distant stations and remote corners of the continent. But now we travel with deeper appreciation for the mysteries that wait in the vast spaces between towns, and the ancient intelligences that watch from the darkness beyond our headlight beams. If you've ever driven the Outback highways at night, you know that particular quality of darkness, how it presses against your windows like something alive, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrible. Hit like and subscribe for more true stories from Australia's remote places, where the impossible still roams free under ancient stars.